Welcome to the World Class Speaking podcast series. This is a place where you will learn how to present, persuade, and profit by improving your communication skills. Each episode in the series is a chapter from the book World Class Speaking in Action. And each chapter is written by a certified world class speaking coach. I'm your host, Matt Miller, and I've carefully crafted and summarized each chapter in the book. Creating a vivid scene is a powerful way to connect emotionally with your audience, enable them to remember your message, and persuade them to take action. In this chapter, you will gain an understanding of the following: why clear, effective scenes are so important, what to put in your scenes to draw in your audience, how to deliver the scenes to keep your audience engaged. Episode 9 is creating a compelling scene. And when I say scene, I'm referring to the experiences that your audience has, mostly visually, but other factors as well that they will get into. And that was a quote directly from the book, World Class Speaking in Action. And this is episode 8. It is part of part 2. And the chapter is called Create a Compelling Scene. And the author of the chapter is David Chase. And David Chase is a certified world-class speaking coach as well as a trainer who helps individuals and organizations maximize their influence through more powerful communication. Now, why is this episode so important? Well, because creating a compelling scene allows the audience to remember what they physically see and what they imagine. They're only able to see and imagine based on how the speaker creates the scene. And a quote by Patricia Fripp, who is a highly desired keynote speaker, says, "People won't remember what you say as much as they will remember what you see when you say it." And I believe this applies to what the audience physically sees as well as what they imagine. Now, in order to create an effective scene, we need to put certain things into the scene. And the things that we need to put in is symbolized through the acronym VAKS, VAKS: visual, auditory, kinesthetics, and smell. So visually, when you're creating a scene on stage, what is the audience seeing? They're looking at you. Create a visual that helps depict the story that you're telling. Also, what does the audience hear? So they want to be able to hear you clearly, but also for you to show emotion, for you to speak faster at times, speak slower at certain times as well, and also to have good contrast in your voice, depending on what type of message you want the audience to receive. And then K stands for kinesthetics. Think of kinesthetics as body movements, and S is for smell. When you're creating that scene, what are you smelling at the time? So there's the visual aspect, the auditory, the kinesthetics, and the smell. And there's 3 components to an effective scene. And the first one is the circumstances. So where are we? And something that's important is you don't want to clutter the story. You want to remove everything that has no relevancy to the story whatsoever. And there's this example in the book, and it talked about, in chapter 2, if you mention that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, well, by chapter 6, that rifle better be shot, or else you need to remove it because it doesn't have any relevancy. And that stuck with me. So think about the things in your story that is necessary and that helps support the overall message. And then if it doesn't, consider throwing it away and getting rid of it, because that'll help declutter it and make it more understandable. If you have too many details, you can bore, distract, or confuse the audience. And then after the circumstances, the second thing is the characters. So who's involved? And you want to be able to introduce your characters. And it's important that you introduce your characters at the beginning. Give them a description. You want to be able to describe the characters in detail. You can think about all the demographics. So what's their age, their income, then also the psychographics. What are their beliefs? What are their values? And then you can also consider giving them a reference name. Let's say the character in your story, let's say his name's Doug. Instead of referring to Doug as Doug, you could refer to him as the guru. or the master, or driven Doug instead of just Doug. It helps the audience remember who that character is by giving them a special name. And then, in addition to the circumstances and characters, the third component of an effective scene is the conflict. Every scene needs to have a conflict. The conflict is the story, and the conflict is the problem. So, you want to introduce the conflict early because once the conflict is established, then the audience will stay engaged. And your goal is to get the audience thinking as quickly as possible what's going to happen next. And then after the three components of an effective scene, taken into consideration the circumstances, characters, and conflict, there's three delivery techniques to create a memorable scene as well. Number one is provide visual cues that align with verbal details. So if I am talking about an amazing sunset, I can use my hands if you're watching this video and kind of show a sunset. Or if I'm describing a really long fence, I can do those hand motions. Very small, I can be narrow. If I'm shooting a basketball, I can give those hand motions as well. If I'm chilly, I can shiver. But you want to be able to provide visual cues that align with the words coming out of your mouth, because if the audience sees it and they hear it, chances are they're going to remember it. Number two, a second technique for delivery is reach to the environment that you've created. For example, if you are creating a scene where there's a table and you draw like a flat surface, you can reach that table like you're putting a cup on that table, or you can acknowledge it throughout the beginning, middle, or end of your speech. Maybe you place a book on that table. But when you create that table, like we talked about at the beginning, make sure it's being used. And then maybe you create a chair, and then maybe you go and sit on that chair that you described. But there's things in the environment that you create that you can utilize throughout the speech to help drive the memorability of it. And world-class speakers don't retell stories. Very important thing, they relive them. When you're giving a speech, try not to read word for word of what your story is, but instead relive the experience, use descriptory details and sensory details, and make your movements matter. Move with purpose. One of the common things when giving a speech is that the speaker will just move without purpose. So an example of moving with purpose would be utilizing the left side of the stage to tell your first story, the middle of the stage to be your transition, and then the right side of your stage to tell your second story. Then you could call back by pointing to those spots on the stage as well. But that's an example of moving with purpose. Something else that's very important when giving a speech and delivering a story that has a scene built into it is the concept of stepping out of the scene. And what that means is a lot of speaking is actually acting. And when you're having a conversation with somebody in a speech, for example, you could stand on the left side and say a few words as yourself, and then you can take a few steps to the other side, and then this could be your mom. And then back to when you speak, move to the other side, then back to the other side when your mom is speaking. And that's all internal dialogue in your speech. But if you wanted to make a point or talk outside of that conversation, you could simply take a step back, which would step you out of the scene, and then you could provide some explanation or some wisdom, and it will be different from the actual dialogue within the speech. And that helps the audience understand that it's not part of the story. You're stepping out of the scene to deliver other details. And here's a quote from the book. As a character in the scene, you cannot engage the audience. That would disengage your audience, jolting them out of the scene. In acting, this is known as breaking the fourth wall, the one between the actors and the audience. The same principle applies to speaking. If you need to interact with the audience, step out of the scene, and this could be a literal step out, moving to a different space on the stage, or it could be a subtle and clear change in posture or voice from character to speaker. And the big thing here is just differentiating yourself while you're in the scene and in the story, and then also when you're stepping out of the story. Then, lastly, another thing to consider is you want to be aligned and you want to be congruent between what you say and what you do. And we talked about this earlier, but if the character in your scene is nervous, act it out in the scene. Show that they're nervous. Then you can step out of the scene as a presenter if you want to make a point. But as we mentioned earlier, if you're driving a car, it'd be good to give those hand motions. If you're shooting a basketball, you can make those hand motions as well. And in summary, for what you're putting into your scene, think about the VAKS, your visual cues, the auditory cues, the kinesthetics, and also smell. And there's 3 components to an effective scene. Number 1 is circumstances. So like paint the picture of where you're at. Then 2 is the characters. Introduce your characters early and describe them with sensory details. And something I've come to realize is that so much of speaking is acting. It's funny how those 2 coincide. And then 3rd component is conflict. What's the struggle? Introduce it early, keep the audience engaged. And then after you consider the VAKS, visual, auditory, kinesthetics, and smell, the 3 components of an effective scene, circumstances, characters, and conflict, there's 3 delivery techniques to create a memorable scene. Number 1, what the audience sees should align with what you say. Number 2, reach to the environment that you've created. And then number 3, move with purpose. Cut out any unnecessary movements. Now that you know the importance of creating a compelling scene using the VAKS, visual, auditory, kinesthetics, smell, what descriptors and sensory details can you incorporate into your next speech or next presentation or next conversation to help you be remembered? Think of the VAKS. Okay. In the next episode, you will learn how to close with impact and leave your audience on a high. That's all we've got for this episode on the World Class Speaking podcast series. Until next time, remember that becoming a great communicator is so important because it leads to greater impact, influence, and income. Thank you for listening and have a great day.